Hello and welcome to the Disruptors podcast, videocast on engaging communities. This is part of our New Ways series, and it's about looking at and understanding the challenges we face in these new ways of working, given the challenges we face with social distancing, with economic challenges, and with social distancing challenges. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this meeting from the lands of the Darug people of the Eora Nation, and I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. Now, today we're going to be talking about engaging communities, and I'm very pleased to be joined by a number of thought leaders, community engaged activists, and I don't know how I would describe you, Shu, but sort of like a crazy mix between creative, architectural, community orientation, but also completely artistic as well. So maybe you could start with Shuang, and you can give us a little bit of introduction to yourself.
Oh, I just had a knock on the door, sorry. So by way of introduction, I'm a young architectural designer. I worked for 7 years in the health and mental health sector. And I now actually I run my own practice, and I've been really fortunate and lucky enough to be working with a lot of community-led projects at a fit-out, design build scale. And I'm also actually now also teaching at Western Sydney University in the architectural faculty as well.
Great, thanks. Kirsten.
I have a background in telco, even though I have never actually touched a telephone line. So I did 14 years with Telstra, then I did about another 8 years with Verizon. So I have a fairly good handle on domestic and international business. Currently, I'm the operations manager for a group called Business in Heels, which is a global community of women helping women to succeed.
Fantastic. And Eugene McGarrell.
So I'm a nurse by background, but that was quite a long time ago. So I've been working in the health and community space for 41 years, predominantly in government and mental health, disability, child protection, and homelessness. And I'm currently working as CEO of Healthy Australia, particularly working in the early childhood education and care sector.
Fantastic. So we're looking forward to a really great conversation with people who are involved in engaging communities right now in very challenging, difficult situations and circumstances. But what I would really like to do is maybe start with you, Eugene, and seeing that you've actually kicked off this business with Healthy Australia right now in the throes of COVID-19 crisis, and your work is to improve the health and welfare of families and communities. What do you see as the biggest challenges of engaging those communities when we're living in a moment of crisis as we currently are?
Yeah, so there's so many challenges, of course, working and engaging with community. I think, first of all, looking at the context of COVID and the crisis that we're all feeling, I think the important thing to remember is that families who are in vulnerable situations have been experiencing crisis and trauma well before COVID hit us. So this is a crisis on top of another crisis, I guess, and the trauma on top of trauma. So it's really important to understand that. I think it's also important to understand that empathy for people in itself is not enough. I think there's a real danger that engaging with community and engaging with people who are not living a privileged life as I am, I guess, there's a danger there that you can be seen as a tourist into people's problems, and that's really difficult to overcome. So look, for me, I think the important thing is to really be embedded and engaged with community by listening and avoiding bureaucratic speak, avoiding conversations about policy, but actually listening to people and what their daily struggles are, and doing that in the way that is, I guess, can lead to action taking place. So I think for me, it's really important to remember that, this idea that we're all in it together, that is sort of true for the pandemic, but actually this crisis has just created another level of crisis for a lot of people who are not privileged, who are experiencing poverty, who are experiencing addiction, mental illness, and are victims to domestic violence. We know that these issues are complex, and one of the big mistakes that any policymaker or any service that's looking to engage is to not simplify that issue and not generate simple solutions to what we know are complex problems.
I love the way that you say that empathy is not enough. And I think that's a key point, or it's one of the challenging points around this, is because we don't necessarily know how to engage through in an empathetic way, necessarily through the medium of the technology that we have at our disposal.
Yeah, that's right. And look, I think it's important to have empathy. I think it's just important to know that that's not enough, and it's also very important that empathy doesn't become sympathy, because no one really wants to be sympathized with. Really, it's about, okay, I'm in a role. I'm a white male, straight guy who's had privilege all my life. So I think it's important to know that and to own that, but also I love that cat, by the way. It's awesome. But for me, I think, the only thing I could do is not deny that privilege, but use the privilege for good, and in a way that can support people to have agency in their own future.
Agency in future. I think that's a really great point. And Shu, I think as a young designer of community spaces, you must be seeing similar situations. How do you see the community shifting in terms of the work that you do?
I think it's really interesting with my profession, where you're so used to being in the physical space and then all of a sudden being removed to that, what that means. So previously, a lot of my design workshops and consultation with the community would be run in the space with a lot of face-to-face drawing workshops, and we actually tried VR a few times as well. But I think the shift for me has actually been taking a step back, and instead of involving the community as we're already designing and building, to take a step back, involve them more in the planning process as well. So still doing the collective discussions and visioning, but interesting enough now through online forums. So I think that's the shift for me. And I was going to actually bring up Archiparlor, which is Pilot Women in Architecture. They've kind of taken a pause to actually start a lot of surveys within women in our profession. They've extended it as well, just to kind of collectivize a broader discussion around what COVID has meant for our design industry as well.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, so I can link that as well to the chat.
And what does that? Is it important to have, I guess, we talk about communities, but we have, I guess, different levels of communities that that we have in our ecosystems. So we have, that particular community that you're working with, and then you'll have a community of practitioners that are up at another level. Are you finding that's a useful way of looking at things, or is it do they have different needs and situations?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I'll use one of my recent projects as an example. So before COVID, I started a project with Woolloomooloo Hope Street Youth Centre, and we actually did face-to-face design consultation and workshops. And then as soon as COVID hit, everything was put on pause. And we had actually a lot of plans with, so the youth centre our clients were actually between the ages of 12 to 18, and we had planned to engage them through the design process. So bring them to see how joinery was going to be made, and even working with the horticulturalists to see how we can green their space. But all of those plans fell through, which were actually going to be the core of the way we were going to directly communicate with, engage them in the design process. But now the shift within that community, they still, so the youth centre is actually for the community who they've got really high dropout rates from high school, and they actually need the space to just do their homework and be away from their home environment, and needing the second space. So they still physically need to go there. And the way that we've kind of come around that is through some more strategic programming. And obviously the space is designed to allow 10 people within that space as well, spaced out with the computers, the 1.5 distancing as well. But we've kind of it's also led by a youth worker as well. So I think for me, programming the space to keep it activated and running has been really important to keep that community space alive. So that's more talking about the community of the space itself, to be more specific, as an example. I think the broader conversation, the community of my design industry, I think that's a little bit harder because we're all still trying to figure out what it's meant for us. And so things like forums within our industry have been really helpful just to see who's on the same page.
It's a really good way of looking at things, and I think the idea of understanding and being able to measure how the impact that you're having on those spaces and on the sense of community engagement and maybe even well-being of your communities is an interesting challenge. Kirsten, do you think we need to be thinking differently about the way that we measure that community engagement now, given where we are?
Well, it's interesting because I think we've got to think right across the board with regards to, who are our communities. So whether you're an employer or you're a manager of people, that's a community. Then you've got, broader perspectives with regards to community. So you could be thinking associations, the groups that both Shu and Eugene work through. If you're a typical ops manager like me, we're all about the numbers. So, we're thinking of retention of our community, whether there's growth, how often people are, participating in activities, whether users are actually generating more content. But I think it comes back to those things are still relevant. But I think we sort of sometimes have to temper what we're doing based on the circumstances associated with each of those different communities. And so anybody who is managing or trying to measure community engagement needs to look at what do they actually need right at this moment. So, for example, if I was a team leader or a manager looking after people, I might have to put a couple of sessions together to sit with my team, working out how they're going, and depending on the sorts of responses or productivity issues that they're dealing with, it's then, maybe I have to break it down, and you actually have to focus as a people manager more on managing people and looking at the needs of each individual person. When you're looking at a bigger group, sometimes like the ones that I'm sort of helping to manage, again, it comes back to being flexible, listening to their needs. What do they actually want versus what don't they want? And that will then drive how you manage, you measure those community engagement items. But, I think a lot of the actual, if we want to get down to the nuts and bolts of it, we're still going to measure a lot of these things the same way that we've been doing. But we might just have to be a bit more flexible at this point around, whether the numbers are up or down. It's a difficult situation at the moment that we're all facing.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of thinking on your feet, creating things on the fly, but also giving the impression that you know what you're doing.
Yes. Flying by the seat of our pants. That's what we're all doing.
That's absolutely true. So, Kirsten, also in terms of that, you have a Melbourne chapter of a networking organisation that used to meet face to face.
Yes.
What are some of the challenges that you found shifting that face to face into the online space?
Look, when COVID first hit, the first couple of weeks, we were very quick to move to a virtual coffee connection event. And we said it fairly clearly, this is when we're going to do it. This is the day. This is the time. It's going to be an hour. These are the benefits. And we were able to do that fairly quickly. But what we noticed with even in the first couple of weeks, a lot of the behavioural traits of individuals, we needed to manage that, because quite often we just needed to listen to people. Quite often, I might have gone in with, this is what I'm going to facilitate, this is how I'm going to run the 1 hour session, and then within about 2 seconds I could tell this is not going to work. So I've suddenly had to have my plan B, my plan C, and then try and meld that together. And it might be, all right, we have to give people an opportunity just to vent. Maybe they need to talk about their concerns. Maybe somebody else has heard about this problem and they've actually got an answer. And quite often you might think you're running something, like a practical event, and you'll go, oh, actually, I really can't. Today is just not going to work. I'm in Melbourne at the moment, and the minute we heard about stage 4, you actually saw physically with people going, oh, I'm not sure that I can cope with this second time around. And so you then had to sort of go, okay, well, what we've had on the board, planning wise, well, we've just had to quickly change it. So, I think it's all about being flexible and really not just listening to people's words, but actually seeing their reactions and their behaviours on screen. And I think, yes, we can't do it physically, but we can still see people's reactions via a video screen. And I think that's been just as important to sort of capture that feedback.
It's interesting. We're talking to some university organisers recently, and they're looking at the role of live video, because a lot of what they're seeing, certainly at, for larger meetings, is that people would turn their video off. And that was not necessarily just because they were conserving bandwidth or struggling with seeing people's faces. That it was to do with a sense of not wanting to engage.
And I think it's really hard. Like, our main audience is females, so there's a home juggle happening for so many people at the moment. They're having to deal with the work from home, homeschooling, domestic duties. If you've got 4 people in a house, and this is a real example, 2 are high school students, there's mum and dad trying to work at the same time, but the kids don't want to see mum and dad walk past their video screen, for the kids to see. And it's not as simple these days as, oh, well, I perhaps don't have the right pants on because I'm only up this way. We're all having to learn, how do we actually put our face on, and how do we present positively. But it's everything. There's all of these elements. But I think it comes down to being as flexible as possible. It's the fact is that there is fatigue happening around video conferencing. People are fatigued because they're just going from one meeting to another. I mean, as I said before, I've got an international background. I worked 3 years from home, New York hours, from Australia, and I just went from meeting to meeting to meeting, for 17 hours a day. That is fatigue, and everybody's feeling it if they're not used to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also something that people who've never been involved in these sorts of video conferencing before are coming to grips with. So they've got quite a massive learning curve, not just about the technology itself, but the way the technology makes you feel. Cool. So Eugene, we've run some sessions with you on the Airworks, and we've also been involved in other projects which were more face to face. But so you've sort of seen different types of technology, different types of workshop approaches, and so on. But then having to apply those workshop techniques to particular communities. what have you seen there in the facilitation and the work, just like Kirsten's saying? How have you noticed that the facilitation and the process has to shift and change between live and virtual conferences or workshops and meetings?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, I think for me personally, co-design or workshopping or that sort of engagement is much better done face to face. I think it feels better for me to do that. Do I get a better outcome? I'll come to that, I guess. But for me, the connection that you have with people face to face, the human to human connection, there's a lot more than words that you absorb. You pick up nuances, you pick up emotions a lot readily, I think. And I think that the information that you gain from the face-to-face forums, it's a warmer level of data, and I think it's a deeper form of data. But having the constraints around COVID, doing the work with you through Airworks recently, what I did notice was that it did provide an opportunity for people that were less likely to speak up to engage. And so we didn't have to wait for there to be a queue to have an opportunity to say what you want to say. And if you're an introvert, you're less likely to push yourself into that space. And what I did find that doing the online co-design work with you was that more people engaged much more regularly than they did. So that's a bonus. Now, at the end of both sets of processes, did we get what we needed? Well, we probably did. I mean, it's just I find the face-to-face much more of an enjoyable process to be part of. And the online one, I think there is an element of fatigue that's been talked about already with that. And I think in terms of motivation, it's very hard, I think, to be as motivated in a online environment than it is in a warm face-to-face environment where you're getting emotions and but I'm an extrovert, so I like that sort of space. So yeah, we got outcomes from both processes. I enjoyed the face-to-face much more than the online one, but the online one does provide opportunities for those that don't normally provide information to better share their information and knowledge and ideas.
One of the things I found interesting, even though I know this is innately true, and like Kirsten, I've worked on a lot of international projects and never had to be traveling because of the technology. Although I think it's different because we're still thinking like a location-based mindset, and what the technology is allowing us to do now is to really easily reach beyond that. So we can bring in people from all over Australia or all over the world into our workshops and our meetings, but we don't necessarily design them that way from the beginning. I feel like we've got to make a bit of a leap to be more inclusive of location diverse input.
Yeah, so I think that there are real advantages and I think we're going to get into a third way of doing things, because there's some real advantages having an online platform that helps support engagement and generating ideas and working with people. And yeah, you can involve more people from further away. But also there is something really important about working in place and working in the context, particularly if you're working with community, because each community, as we know, there's micro communities within community. The context of the community itself needs to be felt and known. And I think you can't get away from, and you shouldn't get away from, working and embedding yourself in that. So I think there's going to be a third way, which is going to bring both together. So we're able to leverage off the online platforms as well as making sure we don't leave aside the value of actually engaging in place.
Great segue, actually. So if we talk, I'll throw over to Shu now. We look at the idea of working with different types of communities and different locations and so on. And you do a lot of work with, obviously, with young people, and you've worked with Behavioural in the past. When we think about young people, is there a particular angle there? Is there a challenge or an opportunity that we need to be aware of?
I think, again, we have to be specific about what young people means and what that age bracket is. But just before I answer that, I just wanted to elaborate on what Eugene was saying about designing with place and locality. I think it's so important. And it's been interesting for me to observe. Actually, I have checked up on a few of my previous clients from last year. So I did a project in Parramatta with Darcy Street Project, and they're a social enterprise cafe. And it was really interesting that they were still operating because once the takeaway was allowed, that people who were still part of that local routine would still be returning. So even though, and we see that through different cafes as well, but just the fact that you don't lose the activation of the space because you've spent time building a community around the locality of the physical space itself. So people return, they check in on you. So I think that's really interesting as well. And then just with the question about young people, Gavin, are you more saying young people with the age bracket that we had at Vibewire?
Actually, good question. I'm finding under 21s have a different mindset and unique needs, and over 21s have a different kind of mindset and needs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my age bracket, so around the late 20s, early 30s, were sort of yuppies, so young professionals. And I'm finding, I think when COVID hit, an important thing for me was to understand who was my support network, who had within the professional background as well, and mentors like yourself, Gavin, checking in on me. That was really helpful. But knowing how to educate myself through the financial and counselling support, feeling like I could do that for myself. But I've been teaching a younger age bracket, so I'm teaching second year tertiary students, university students. And that age bracket is about from 19 to 22 with a few mature age students. And I found that there was a disconnect there between how they knew what financial support and counselling was needed. And I felt almost like I had a role to then tell them and support them in that way. And in terms of engaging them, so I might just talk more specifically about my students, and also relating back to what Kirsten was saying about people not turning the screen on. Teaching online is a whole other thing, and engaging that age bracket, keeping them motivated through a project. So we are teaching architectural projects online, and without having the face-to-face connection has been difficult as well. But again, we start the class just checking in on each other, and I think that's really helped. Going back to what Eugene's saying about empathy and not sympathy. So I always check in with my students before we moved on to the project as well. But I think having a project really helps through this time. Having something to focus on and upskill on, and using the time productively has been good.
Fantastic. Great response. But yes, I think that's very true, to sort of see the different challenges around teaching and engagement. I think it goes back to what Kirsten was saying before, is you need to sense and respond to your audience. But it's, again, you need to find different types of cues, different types of perspectives, and maybe even be very explicit in asking or checking in with people who are participating in your events. So Kirsten, I'm guessing that you see some similarities here with the kind of events that you run, but is there something particular that resonated with you with the way that Shu was talking about her online engagements?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities that are going on. I've probably had a lot of experience in dealing, virtually. So I think, anybody that's facilitating sessions, whether they be webinars, whether it be education or, groups of people, it comes down to, and it's a bit of that empathy process, but it's about having really good communication skills. Eugene talked about, being an extrovert versus an introvert. If you're a people manager or if you're doing a virtual project with people, there is always going to be people who, and I have to say I'm an extrovert. I speak with my mouth. What comes out of my brain comes virtually out through my mouth. Whereas I've understood, with introverted people, they're thinking sometimes in their head. And if you're going to be facilitating sessions, it's really good to learn some of those key skills around how do you communicate, how do you perhaps facilitate and give people options to talk so that everybody feels that they're being heard. It's very much about authenticity. So people can have the opportunity to engage and, having your own personality show through. And perhaps it's about making groups smaller so that you can have a genuine conversation as well. I think we've got an opportunity at the moment to really mix it up and just try new and different things, throw things at the wall and see what sticks. And if it doesn't work, then try something else. There's no issues with that. I think, and unfortunately we're dealing with a lot of cultural issues. And if you're not from that background, you aren't going to have walked a mile in those people's shoes. So you're not necessarily going to recognize that. And time zone issues. If you're working in an international team, you've got to be, mindful of the fact that not everybody's on the same time zone that you are, and perhaps rotate, so everybody gets the worst time, the 2 a.m. Time if you've got to have a meeting. So I think it's about being flexible. Working across Asia into Europe and then into the US. It's not easy.
Absolutely. I love the idea of sharing the load. Interestingly, I guess the other thing about it is being, time zone aware, because often, so last night I was working late on a report, and I got an email saying, hey, that 3 a.m. call, we can actually do it at 5 hours later if that's more convenient for you. But that message didn't come through till midnight. So,
and there's lots of great tools that people can use, whether it's in Google Mail. You can actually have, in your calendar, you can actually have 2 time zones, so you can actually work that out fairly quickly. But it's also about being aware that not everybody has a McMansion. And so you've got your own office in your house. And so, if you've got multiple generations living in one home, which a lot of Asian countries do, they may not have a place to actually go and be able to carry on a meeting if it's the worst time of, the day for them. So it's just being cognizant of some of these really different things that perhaps we're just not thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's so we're actually going to throw open the panel to some questions from the audience, and I can see a few of those questions coming through. If you do have a question, please just drop it into the comments and it will come through to us. In the meantime, if I maybe just jump over to Eugene, you've worked with many vulnerable groups in your career history. Do we ask too much of communities when we want to engage them? So, do we? Is it a function of us asking and setting an agenda that is sometimes difficult for audiences or individuals to participate in?
So I've got a short answer and a long answer. So I'll give you the short answer first. So the short answer is yes, we do. And look, I think that there's, first of all parts of government, the 3 levels of government, then the departmental silos of governments, and then other agencies tend to engage with communities separately. So, communities are sick and they're sick to death of having different departments coming to visit them and engage with them. And then when people go and leave, there's another group of people that come to engage. And nothing's much more frustrating than having been consulted and there's been no action taken, and then people come again and ask the same questions again and again. So I think it's remarkably frustrating, and we have to be very careful about how we do that. I think it's important also that there's a dance between the community and your agency if you want to engage with them, because it's really important that you're invited into the space rather than go into the space without that invitation. and that's quite a nuanced dance to have. So it's not an easy skill. I think the other thing is, we all get asked, do you want to rate this app, or do you want to give us feedback on this thing? And I don't know about you, but when I get those emails, I just delete them. What's in it for me? Why would I provide that feedback? And so I suspect that in the future, 10, 15, 20 years from now, we'll be better at that, because just like organizations pull big data and they use our information to make decisions themselves, I think there's got to be a time where our data, our information, our thoughts, and that goes for everybody in community, is monetized. I mean, if you want that information, are you willing to pay for it? Are you willing to, if you want the information to make your service better, are you willing to actually pay for that information? Or if not, can you get clear about what value my time is going to give? Because there is an arrogance there, and look, we've all done it. We've all gone into communities that let's have a workshop and let's co-design a solution. But there's an arrogance there that that we're coming into almost act as some sort of savior in that community. But I think it's really important that we change that dynamic, and we're getting clear about what results and what value is going to be provided back to that community once engagement takes place. I also think there's a role for joint commissioning, and I know that there's more and more work and frameworks around supporting joint commissioning, so that primary health networks, local government, state government, federal government, they and philanthropists, they come together and they say, well, if you're going to fund that, we'll fund this, and rather than duplicating or making sure or avoiding gaps in service provision. And that joint commissioning needs to be part of the analysis of what's needed in local communities. So the short answer is yes. And I think that it's very frustrating for people to get asked again and again and again, particularly if there's no value that's been created from that engagement.
Excellent. Shu, you're probably in the same zone. You're working from a design perspective and sort of bringing communities into a design process. Do you find, or maybe you've found ways to avoid that disillusionment with your communities?
What do you think that disillusion
maybe
from,
from
Gavin?
being involved in something but not seeing the fruits of it, or not seeing the immediate fruits of it, or
Yeah. Well, I think that comes back to being transparent as well with the communities. And I really like Matt's comment in the comment section talking about our change of language from managing communities to facilitating. I think that's really interesting. And I'm honestly learning that as I develop my design process as well. I might just have a go at tying in a few things that I've read in the comments through local planning, and how COVID has had a shift in our approach to designing for open spaces and our value for open spaces. I think it'll be a really interesting opportunity for local communities to be coming together and leading discussions around how to make the local open spaces better and more accessible to the wider community, and then engaging young designers or architects to help them innovate and guide them through our skills, our particular skills specific to planning and drawing designs and concept designs, but actually our skills in facilitating and hearing the needs and developing a brief with a local community. But I think at the end of the day, it needs to be community-led, and the states and federal governments can definitely provide grants, but I think the vision needs to be driven locally.
Fantastic. That's a great response. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know whether they'll be disillusioned, because at the end of the day, if they're involved in the process that's transparent, they're going to go through the ups and downs that we all go through, the knockbacks and the red tape, whatever that is. So I think that'll be a good way to avoid disillusionment.
Great. So we've actually got some questions coming through. We've got one from Judy Hendricks. So how do you motivate community members if you're a community manager? So maybe Kirsten, you look like you're smiling at that one.
Look, it's an interesting process, and it takes time. Look, Judy, I would recommend actually just jumping on, like doing a virtual catch up with people, sitting down, being really relaxed about it. We've done it through a process of just constantly building relationships. And so by doing that and asking, being interested in other people and what they're actually trying to achieve personally and professionally, it allows you then to get a fairly good feel, even in a very short period of time, of what they're actually wanting. And then you can work towards, well, how do I actually motivate them? Because you're going to have to put in different activities based on what are those things that you're hearing from each of those different people. Because, there'll be, some things that you can segment together, but there will be others that, are totally out of left field, and you're going to have to do something a little bit different. And that's, that comes back to, knowing who is your target market that you're working with and what are you actually trying to achieve overall as a vision and a mission for your community as a whole. So I perhaps haven't totally answered that question, Gavin, but I'm hoping that gives a bit of information to Judy.
Yeah, Eugene.
So I know that there's been quite a lot of success with a model of participatory budgeting. So it seems to me that the disconnect between the community engagement and how resources are actually going to be allocated. I think there are ways, and we know there are ways where you can say, well, we have X to allocate to deliver these results. Can we engage the community in the decision making around how that budget can actually be invested to deliver those results? And it just seems that's much more of an authentic way of engagement. Whereas, I've seen government agencies so often ask the question, consult, and do something completely different because they didn't hear the answer that they wanted to hear. So people don't see that's a genuine process. But participatory budgeting is about put the budget in with the people that are going to be experiencing the results of those programs.
Fantastic. One of the things I have found, which is quite interesting when it comes to community management, especially in this current, sort of socially distanced time, is sometimes you have to take the conversations offline. So I've started phoning people, and then actually people say, "Oh, this is great. I'm glad that you rang," because I'd much prefer to talk to you one-on-one, just on a phone, rather than on a video hookup. Is anyone else finding that? Shu, are you sort of seeing that kind of approach being useful or relevant?
Yeah, definitely. And then again, back to my students and what Kirsten was saying before about just having smaller rooms. So I use Zoom, and in the breakout rooms, everyone has their video on. It's a lot more comfortable. It's basically trying to create a safe space through this virtual screen as well.
I love the idea of the safe space, and it's a perfect segue to Matt's question, which is around words mattering and the importance of using words and feelings, empathetic language that allows you to create those safe spaces virtually and effectively in real life, just in a socially distanced life, I guess. And I also like the idea of facilitating communities, but I also often have a challenge with the word facilitating or facilitator. It feels like the word itself distances us. Is that something that anyone else experiences?
So I might take that one, Governor.
Yep.
I think usually if you're going to be participating in these groups, you are one of the target market. And you're passionate about what you're actually trying to achieve with that group. So, I think that does absolutely help. And I think, when we see facilitation, it's not about a power position. This is purely about making sure that everybody in the group gets an opportunity to be heard. And that's what a good facilitator actually does. They recognize the cues that they should be looking for. They should be making sure that, one particular person isn't taking over the entire group. And they can do it in a very subtle and appropriate way so that nobody's feelings are left being hurt. But everybody does get to feel that they have been heard.
Fantastic. Shu, you look like you're about to say something as well.
Yeah, I was just gonna say what I found as I've been in a few situations where I've facilitated design discussions, and I've always felt that my role is to actually create a framework for the discussions and actually coming up with a methodology in which I can plug in the information collected from these co-design sessions. So that for me comes from my professional side of knowing how to lead discussions, but not necessarily feeling like I'm distanced necessarily. I'm almost part of the same discussions.
I mean, I guess that's part of why I like the idea of hosting discussions rather necessarily than facilitating them. Interesting topics. Like as I said before, if you have questions you'd like the panel to answer, please drop those into the comments section. There was one that I did see a while back, which I thought was interesting, from Macaroon Bear, which was around how do we engage people with living with disability, and any suggestions that any of us might have around assisting their online engagement. I might throw that over to Eugene.
I knew you would. So I think we know engagement in an authentic way with people with disabilities is a challenge because I think you really need to. We talk about person-centered planning, but really get and try to get into the shoes of the person with that disability or experiencing that disability. I think online engagement is adding another barrier to that connection. So I think it's quite difficult to do that. Although, again, it depends on the disability, of course. It's there's so many types of disabilities that there's not one straight answer for this. But I do think it's an extra challenge, and I think anybody who can come up with an adaptable, person-centered online design thinking platform will make a lot of money under the NDIS, because I know that's something that they would probably love to have. So I don't have one answer for that, but just to say that, look, it's another barrier, and it's a challenge in itself to be authentic in that planning process when you're one-to-one, let alone with an extra barrier.
Absolutely. Kirsten, do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, there's a lot of those groups too, the community groups, or at least those associations that support those with a disability. And I think they're the first place to go, sometimes from a best practice perspective, because they actually know, that would be my first port of call if I was needing to do any work specifically with those with a disability. It's actually asking for assistance. And saying, okay, how best do I actually do this? Especially if I don't come from that background and I really don't understand it, and ask them, how is it best that I actually engage with those people, get that, sort of feedback, and try and put that into place, and ask constantly for feedback from those within the community. And I definitely understand where Eugene is coming from. We're probably over asking in some respects, but I think if you do it and then follow through and show that you actually put those pieces of feedback into actions, and you can show that community group that you've done that, you're more likely to succeed in those sorts of situations.
Fantastic. I totally agree. My daughter has hearing impairment, and she often struggles to speak with people if they are wearing masks, because she can't hear them speaking, or she can't lip read, so she and see what they're saying. So it's an interesting challenge which you're trying to balance, that face to face when you're doing face to face. But then even when we're doing something virtual, sometimes the frequency of sound coming through an audio device means that she can't hear very well because of the different decibel ranges. Complications, of course. Another question from Judy. So do you have tips on how to facilitate your community, keep your community engaged, and make them feel they're valued by being part of your community? So speaking to how do we reward that engagement?
So I'll try and answer some of those. So tips on how to facilitate the community. So we have a really fun, relaxed Thursday morning coffee connection that we have with the group. They come in and they come out based on what's happening in their daily group. We try to stick to a fairly basic structure, but it can change. Again, it's about, using breakout rooms, pulling, I like to think that we only put people into, maybe 4 or 5 in a smaller group so that they actually get to know each other and they can have much better conversation. And part of my framework is that we have really good, we've got a number of questions. I have my box of questions. And so, as we push people out into breakout rooms, I actually throw them a question, and it could be, really fun, like, okay, if you're a chocolate, what chocolate bar would you be and why? All the way through to much more complex conversations around, have they got mentors? What are they doing about revenue? All of those sorts of things. But we don't do, I usually do only 2 questions in an hour session. But we do find that by doing it that way, keeping it very authentic and being relaxed and having a really good laugh, I have found that has, we've gotten really good feedback from our community, and they do feel valued because they keep turning up week after week, the same people, because they're looking for that sense of, of community, and that they're getting something from it, which I think is a great thing.
Absolutely. I think that's certainly one part of sort of facilitating that community and keeping people engaged. But also, what do you think of the role is of scheduling? So sort of making sure that something happens at a regular cadence.
I'm a process person by heart. I love it. I can't help myself. That's why I'm an ops manager. But I think when you do that, it allows people to put that into their diary. They've got so many other things going on. If they've got to do homeschooling, if they've got meetings at work, I think it's about respecting people's time at the end of the day. And we're very big on that because we recognise that people are trying to potentially do 4 different jobs and, look after kids and do everything else that's on their plate. I think if you can give them, time in advance and they know exactly what's happening, it provides a level of comfort for some people. For others, it's not. It's not easy when they're dealing with a schedule, but I think in the majority, if we can show that we're being respectful of people's times and we start on time and you finish on time, that's a very big thing for people, because time at the end of the day is money.
Absolutely. And also attention as well. I think that's we feel I don't know if any of you are feeling the same way, but I feel like I have less time now than I had before. So on that note, I'm kind of interested to know how you feel about these kind of sessions. Like, is it a good idea to run these in the evening after work, or in the morning before work, or early in the day during the day? What do you think, Shu? Is there some kind of is there a different reset now around if we're not going into an office and working somewhere in a location?
I'm loving this time slot, the evening wine time. I was also really relating to what Kirsten was saying about structure, and I'm finding that a lot of needing to provide that to the students. I didn't realize I was a part of a community, but I actually am talking to you guys about tonight, actually. But the students that I work with, we've got the subject outline, but I'm finding that every lesson I have to really help them know exactly what they need to do for the next class and really be planning with them so that they know how to spend their days, because they're just stuck at home. They're in a really strange routine of being in their home environments. A lot of them are still living at home. And then for me, needing to take that advice and finding some structure, getting coffee at the same time every day, having my lunch break, and then still fitting my schedule around some sort of time frame as well.
Fantastic. Eugene, what about you?
Look, It depends on the audience that we want to engage. I mean, I run webinars in the early childhood education and care sector, and if I did it during the day, nobody would be able to be there. So we do them at 7 o'clock at night. But one of the advantages, of course, is you can record them, so making them available for people who can't see the webinar. But to answer your question about the reset, I think there has been a reset. I think for me personally, I'm finding I'm much more flexible with my productive hours and how I span them out throughout the day. So I can do that. I know I can go for a run, but because I know I'm working a bit later today, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a reset.
Interesting. Cool. So in order to be respectful of everyone's time, it's now 6:25, which means we're about 5 minutes from our end. I'd like to turn it over to each of you to maybe give us a 30-second final thought on the future of engaging communities. Maybe I can start with you, Shu.
Oh, I want to go second.
You want to go second? Okay. Well, let's throw it to Kirsten and then Shu, and then Eugene.
All right. So my takeaway, I think, is that engagement is often not about the numbers, but it's in the heartfelt relief when people have had a good, experience, and they're really happy to tell you, and it's part of that unsolicited feedback that you get.
Fantastic. Shu.
I just needed a way to talk about it because I feel like sometimes if I'm talking too much within the design world that it's not so relevant. But I think some of the core things that I've learned through my practice of engagement is I don't think COVID's changed too much of that, in that I still really value collaboration and still talking to the same people within my community, creative community. Some of the things that we have planned this year, and Gavin knows we did on Sydney's Design Festival last year, we did a collective creative showcase on his rooftop. And I think that started a conversation of collaboration, of meeting different designers and almost building a new community. And I think that hasn't changed, whether it's online or in person. Those conversations are still able to be continued even through this process. They're still seeing what everyone's up to, still finding interesting creative ideas to work collectively together. And then the online tools become a way to enable that, not restrict those processes. So I think collaboration is still a really valuable part of the experience.
Fantastic. And Eugene.
Yeah, so for me, I think my take home is that engagement isn't an end in itself. So it's very easy to get involved in engagement. I love engagement. It's great. I love it. But it's not an end in itself. And to get clear on the outcome that you're trying to achieve through the engagement. And when we're engaging, let's do it together. If we're working with the community, let's engage as a whole and look at delivering results back to that community that you're engaging with, and close the loop so that there's a real understanding of, we engaged, we made promises, we delivered, and these are the results back to you. So that makes the next cycle, one that people are more likely to get engaged in. And I think over time, you're going to get a snowball effect where engagement becomes part of the cycle.
Fantastic. That's a great way of wrapping. Thank you. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for their time this evening, and for all of you who are watching the live stream. We've also been recording this session and we'll be sharing it tomorrow. It will be live on the web and on YouTube. You can also catch our last panel event from The Great Reset with Dr. Patrina Casey, Nadine Castle and Wayne Slagar on the New Ways series website at theair.works/New Ways. In the meantime, stay safe, stay well, and let us know if we can help you with your communities, with your creative collaboration and your consultation processes via the Airworks. Thanks, good night, and we'll close this stream off for now. Have a great evening.
Bye, everyone.